Zach, I hate to say it. You just bored me to death. And I think if your mom is watching this, she just tuned out.
I'm gonna start this off with a real question. I know that millennials, we are of the, what is millennials? What years does it go to? The 1980s?
I think it's 82, 83 to 96 or something like that.
Okay. So our group gets harped on pretty hard for not being very good at communication, at communicating one with another, because we are technology gurus. We're constantly staring at our phones or using social media or talking over Zoom rather than being in the shed. So let me ask this question. Are we better or worse at communicating than our parents, than the previous generation? Better or worse?
So if I could plug, we did get some social media participation, and they may spur some conversation. So I won't say the names of the people just because I don't know if we've set a precedent for that to be done. But let me just read 8 of them. And some of them I think are amazing. So if I'm looking at the response to the generational question, one response was worse by far. This generation is soft, way too soft. Another response was,
wait, was that
yes.
coming from, tell us the generations from which these
Oh,
are.
that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So this individual is graduated the same year we did.
Okay.
The next person also within our group. In fact, it's safe to say that all of these responses are within our own generation specifically, because I know there's the Gen Z is after millennials, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Anyways, so another person's response was, yes, both. We have a lot we could learn from each other, I think. Another person said, unfair question. Every circumstance is different. We all adapt and we all have different challenges. Another person said, that's like asking who's better. Backstreet Boys or NSYNC. Impossible. And then they continued with a similar response and said, impossible to compare. Each face different challenges and environments. Almost, very similar. Another person said worse and better. There's many stellar youth, but also not so much youth. And then
well said.
Yeah.
That's a real breakdown in communication there.
And then my wife got in on the action and said, we all suck in some way or another. We're all great in some way or another.
So in some way or another, everybody was just a some way or another response.
So
I think most people were, I guess, kind of saying, the nature of the question may not be the best, but also just acknowledging that there is a difference. But yeah, let's talk into it.
So I've got a premise that I'd like to put forward, right? So if you look at the level of education of our generation compared to previous generations, whether it's our parents or our grandparents, we are more intelligent, more informed, have access to more information, and know more things than any previous generation, including human psychology and what is good and bad for human psychology. Now, I look back at things that my parents or my grandparents have said to me in good faith, meaning good things, and now hearing about all this research that looking back at them made them look like idiots because they were doing things that were detrimental to the young mind, right? So there's a part of me that thinks we have more tools to communicate more effectively, to avoid doing psychological damage to peers and especially young people. On the counterpoint, though, I will say that communication is a skill just like everything else. And I don't know what the data is behind how much of our communication is in person or over the phone today versus, 30 years ago. But I would say that if it's a matter of volume, if we just speak to people less than we did way back then, because we're just watching Netflix and chill all day, then it would make sense to reason that yes, we are worse at communicating. That's my premise. We have more tools, we are more intelligent, but if we don't communicate as much as they did in the past, it's just a natural consequence of us not being as good at it.
What do you mean by more intelligent? Because I would push back and say, well, that would depend on which perspective you're, what the definition of intelligence is. Because I feel like my parents are way smarter than me.
Well, they've got more life experience, and I mean, you need to remove the subjective and look at the objective. This is not Spencer versus his parents. This is everybody in the world our age versus everybody in the world your parents' age. And on average, our age is much more educated, much more, many more, much higher percentage of college degrees. We've got much higher. I mean, I'm building a shed right now myself. I learned it in the last week by watching YouTube videos, right? Mm-hmm. My parents wouldn't have been able to do that 30 years ago.
Do you drive a Dodge Stratus?
So we're not necessarily more capable. We just have more tools and are more educated, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, Brian, is that using like the metrics for like IQ, or is it just saying that we're more educated? And I know that there's debate around like the efficacy of IQ tests and whatnot, but
if you look at all of it, education level, IQ,
okay, so you're saying that
number of random facts, any way that you describe intelligence outside of human experience, like, the wisdom of having a 60-year life versus 30, if your parents and everybody who's 60 years old today was brought down to our age, we would be smarter than they would be on average. We would be more intelligent. We would have a higher IQ. We would have a higher level of education.
Jordan, you had a comment.
I did have a comment, and it was another way of reiterating what Brian said, because I agree with it. I think because of the tools that we have, going back to communication, I think that maybe on average, perhaps people are communicating less and they get less practice, and perhaps they're on average, the bell curve is a little bit less communicative or skilled with communication, but the extremes are much more, they're much greater in their capacity, meaning the poor communicators are much poorer or worse than they've ever been, and the good communicators are much better than they've ever been. Using an example, perhaps 200 years ago, this is a physical example, men were perhaps more physical than they are now. Perhaps a lot of more millennials are just a little bit weaker, and they study art, and they do, they're just pretty much, the genders are blending. But because of the tools we have today, you'll see these strongman competitions who have like every capacity to just blow all the testosterone out of the water. And I think I would say it's the same with communication, because we have access to so many studies and so much research, and including practice, online or whatever. So because of the tools, it flattens the curve, COVID-19 terminology, and
well done.
It extremes more extreme.
So let's apply this then to this social media craze that we have going on, that we are participating in right now, right, with our podcasts and different things that we post online. So I think there's some people out there, Gary Vaynerchuk comes to mind, or I don't know if I said his last name right, Gary V. But he would argue anytime, someone says, hey, people are terrible communicators, millennials are terrible communicators, Generation Z is terrible communicators. He would say, no, they just do it differently than you do. They do it on social media. They communicate on social media. They're communicating more than, you ever did with a broader group than you ever did. And, you're judging them for that. So give me some thoughts on that. Do you guys feel like social media is benefiting our communication or worsening our communication, or yes? You know what I mean? Is the answer yes? Zach, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there's a lot, and I feel like it's very difficult for me to kind of articulate it. But okay, I think it's a remarkable thing that we as humans communicate the way that we do. We can say that animals communicate in certain ways, but that their toolkit of communication methods is a lot smaller than ours, right? As far as we know, maybe there's something that we can't sense that some animals are doing that is far more advanced and effective than ours are. But I think you want to kind of bring it back to where it's like, why do we communicate? And why does communication make us more or less successful, more or less happy? I think that it's one example or one comparison that I like is that communication is an exchange of goods, like business or products, but the product is like intellectual goods, intellectual products, and you can transmit knowledge or ideas, and people can choose to receive them or reject them, and that all has this impact as our consciousnesses are interacting with each other and wanting to get to a certain objective and using communication in a variety of means. Because I think it is interesting that we can communicate on so many different ways. So we can communicate on social media, we can communicate in person, there's body language, there's people can sometimes communicate through acts where no words are necessary, more than words. You say it best when you say nothing at all. All those, there's so many like infinite variations of how we try to get a message across, that the thought that I was thinking lately is that I think the best communicators are the adaptive communicators. If it is true that what Gary Vaynerchuk says, Gary V, if it's true that it's really just a difference in how communication is happening, but in what they learned, they're really good at it, then somebody who can learn how to communicate different from their original template is going to be a successful communicator, because they can tap into other groups, other communities in a way that others can't or aren't willing to.
I like that. I love that you boiled it back to why do we communicate? And I've fallen into this trap many times on social media where I feel bad for some people who are, maybe posting something online hoping to see 215 hearts show up, that the purpose of that particular communication to the world was for a like or for a comment. And I get it. I get it because I create content. I like to create content because I like to start conversations. I like to make people happy with what I do. And sometimes that heart button or a comment lets me know that, whatever I posted did that. However, it can be toxic. It can cause kids to feel like their worth is based on, I don't know, the value. I know we're going down a different road here, but I just liked what you said about communication and why do we do it why are we communicating on Facebook or on Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, and what purpose that is. Anyway, continue on the same question we were on before. I derailed us a little bit there. Brian.
Yeah, can I, so the social media, the question, right? So the underlying purpose for Facebook and Twitter, I mean, their underlying goal is to increase the valuation of the company and make as much money as possible, right? And these companies have employed tens of thousands of attention engineers to figure out, okay, what keeps people more engaged as long as possible And it's no secret now, I feel like we are pretty informed about the fact that, guess what? People tend to pay more attention to the news and stay longer on social media if there are negative emotions attached to what they're seeing rather than positive, right? I love seeing positive content on social media, but most of the content on social media is not positive in nature. I mean, I'm in several groups, cycling groups. There's this, virtual cycling app called Zwift, and there's a group on Facebook online. And every day, someone posts a question on there, and 85-90% of the answers are just, "Hey, you're an idiot for asking that question. Have you not seen that question asked before?" It's so much negative response. I feel like people are not coping. I think a part of it's bad diet. I think a part of it's the lack of exercise that most people do today. People aren't, they're not finding creative or effective outlets for their frustrations. And I feel like social media has become the place to let out all of my frustrations. So yeah, I do think that communicating through social media can be negative. And just on a personal note, people who I have a great relationship with, I have to unfollow on social media because they're too negative or too spiritual or too this or too that. And it makes me feel feelings of anger towards them, even though I know in a one-on-one, in-person, face-to-face conversation, I'm going to love spending time with that person. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Did you unfollow me? That would
Spencer's
be,
daily
I mean,
Spencer's daily bits
Daily
is too
Bit.
rated G for
It's
me.
just like,
I just had to
no
unfollow.
way.
They're too spiritual.
Jordan, did you have any
I
commentary
had a
on
comment on
social
the
media?
very last point, in that one-on-one or personally, eye contact is huge because people have every inhibition when they're on social media to just, I mean, you can say whatever and you can hide behind it. Even if you're hiding behind your name, even if it's not anonymous, it's so much easier to be negative and just say something like, "You're an idiot."
Mm-hmm.
You're an idiot. But
Yeah.
it's really hard to do in person. And I found the same thing, and Brian will probably know this, and anybody else that has done sales, looking at somebody straight in the eye really can like tone them down. Like de-escalation is a big thing. I used to work at a group home for troubled youth. There's a residential treatment center. And I was actually pretty dang good at the de-escalation bit, because rather than like trying to communicate something eloquent or use aggressive body language, I found it was best to look at somebody straight in the eye and try to catch their attention, and then just ask them questions about themselves, asking more and more questions. And then things began to, after doing that, I found that they come to this place where we want them to be. And we also find that we're pretty much agreeing on everything. It's just, it skewed off in a tangent that's really hard to do. So anyway, that's kind of the obvious issue with social media and trolling. You can hide behind a screen.
Yeah. So to bring it back to one of the comments that a listener, wrote to you, I really liked that someone just called out our generation and essentially said, yeah, we're terrible communicators. I kind of appreciate that because it highlights something I do think that, and I think he made the comment, we're way too sensitive. I don't know if anyone out there has read, I'm trying to remember his name, Haidt.
Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt, Coddling of the American Mind. But and he has several other books that are also phenomenal. But one of the stories he brings up in there right at the beginning of the book that just resonated with me was this idea that we shouldn't be candles, that we should be fires. Because a candle, any kind of varying opinion or something that you don't like or something someone says, you immediately get blown out if you're a candle. But all of that wind and conversation and communication fuels a fire, and it makes a fire stronger. And I just like that comparison, because I feel like it is true. In some ways, our generation has become more sensitive, and I think we get accused of that by the older generation a lot. You hear all the stories of walking. Yeah, I walked to school, with snow up to my knees, uphill both ways, all of that, that we hear. But it's important to remember with our communication as well, we don't need to just be physically tough, but we need to be able to communicate in tough ways. When things get hard, we can't just be blown out by someone's varying opinion. Brian, did you were itching to say something, and then I have a question.
Yeah, just really quick. I don't think it's a bad thing to be sensitive. I don't think it's a bad thing to be to talk about our feelings. This whole idea that you have to be a man's man and have lots of testosterone, and the only way to solve your problems is to just either yell or bottle it up or go throw the TV against the wall, or that's ridiculous. Let's be real. I love the fact that I can tell my 4-year-old son, as of last week, he's now 4, that when he does something, I love that I can just look in his eyes and be like, Parks, that hurt my feelings. And that responded to that. And he responds to that. He responds to me saying that made me sad. That really made me sad. And so, yeah, this whole thing about, us being sensitive, I get that, that there's this whole outrage culture where people are just waiting to be offended at stuff, which I think is part of the problem. But in general, I don't think it should be a bad thing to talk about our feelings. I just don't.
Yeah. I like that.
I love that contrast. And I think that where we get so stuck is this either or kind of thinking. Like when Spencer reads comments about how if you can weather storms, it'll only make you stronger. If you're willing to put yourself out there and receive the feedback, good and bad, it can only serve to refine maybe your ideas. But I haven't read the book, and I really do appreciate Brian saying that we need to be genuine and authentic about what we're feeling. But I think, again, you can't control how people will respond to that. And I think that maybe somebody who's willing to be vulnerable and say, hey, that hurt my feelings. And if somebody responds and says, well, you're a wimp then, right? It would be, I don't know, I would hope that person, even in the moment of, maybe receiving some emotional trauma, would be able to say, well, that person, didn't understand how to respond to what I said. That doesn't make what I said dumb. It doesn't make this person heartless necessarily. Of course, it could mean that. And it could mean that you're soft. But at the same time, we don't know if that was the right or the wrong thing. But, there's nothing wrong about saying how you feel. But even as I say that, I think there are times when you probably don't want to be completely honest about what you're feeling for a variety of reasons. Maybe that saying a certain thing that could be true will set somebody off in a negative way. And maybe it's a practical thing that's not even an in-depth emotion where you're just like, I don't want to deal with the reaction that will come from me being honest.
It's like the honesty setting on Interstellar for those robots.
Yeah. So it only makes it more complex.
I was going to say, in response to Brian, when I was talking about toughness, I think I'm talking more about the toughness to be able to hear somebody else's opinion and not be offended. I'm not talking about toughness in terms of saying, I'm not going to communicate the way I feel. And I don't think the book was pushing that position either. But to your point, Brian, geez, we are so much more, we are better informed these days because of people like Brene Brown, who have taught us that, man, you don't need to be a man's man. You can cry, you can say how you feel, and you can feel emotions, and that is all okay. I feel like in that arena, we become hopefully better communicators because we feel like we can actually have emotions.
Yeah, one quick example, and then I don't want to talk here too long. I think a good example of that is in our communication on the chat. I sent that first message. Hey, should we do this idea? Should we do this type of episode? Zach made his first comment. Yeah, it sounds like a great idea. And then kind of the rest of his comment. And then I'm like, my response is, what did you mean by that? And then Zach's next comment was, what didn't I make clear? Now there's two ways to read that, right? There is, Zach is genuinely trying to understand what I'm concerned about. The other way to read that is kind of a slap in the face, like, dude, like, what's your problem? I just said it right there. Can't you read? And so I do think a lot of it is based on, we can control our intent, right? We can't control the interpretation that someone else has on our message.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a general rule of how to have a happy and healthy life is to just have the assumption that when a message can be read in two different ways, assume that they have a good intention and not a bad intention.
I tend to have a fear of like offending people. Like I do not like, I'm very careful with my words. I don't want to offend someone. I try not to offend anybody. And sometimes that gets me in trouble because I don't communicate directly. So why do you think we have fears of just saying exactly what we feel? And Zach, you started touching on this just a little bit before I accidentally cut you off, but like, why do we have so much fear around saying exactly, I don't know, what we feel?
You know, I think part of communication is this type of, there's a power dynamic to it where there's this innate desire to want the upper hand. And the place where this comes out most clearly is in, in the dating scene or in romantic, scenarios where, you start dating someone and early on, you're not supposed to show that, like, you're not supposed to, fall head over heels for someone on the first date or the second date. You don't want to come off too strong too soon. And I think it's not okay, I feel like, to be like, hey, I know we've only gone on one date, but I really like you and would love to spend more time with you. That just doesn't happen. And I think the reason for that is that once the most power that you can have in a romantic setting is to care less than the other person. So yeah, I don't
Care
know.
about yourself less.
No. Care, have less, lesser feelings for that person than they have for you, if that makes sense. So if you care less, then you have more say. You are kind of higher in the power hierarchy in that romantic setting. So I don't know. I haven't dated, been married for 7 years now. So it's an old example, but I don't know. I like being able to communicate exactly how I feel. It's refreshing.
Zach, how was the whiz?
Dude,
if ever there was a whiz, there was the whiz.
There ever was a whiz.
On a scale of 1 being clear and 10 being extremely unhealthily yellow, like 117 hours yellow, where you at?
Honestly, I didn't even look. I just did the deed and tried to
Did you
hustle back.
sit or stand?
Dude, am I crazy? I honestly don't even know which one I did.
Zach, you need to be able to remember how you peed 10 seconds ago.
I'd be willing to bet that I was standing. I can't imagine, like, I didn't feel like there was any need to revise my previous number 2 with a safety bidet spray. So I think I was probably standing up.
So I have never stood. No, not, I shouldn't say never stood. Since I don't know, probably since my mission. I don't think I have
never
ever
been
stood.
standed.
I have never stood at a
Never
toilet.
never
At a
been
urinal.
standed.
Yes. Never been standed up.
Never been.
No, I don't. I when it's a toilet,
Under-
I can't handle the splashing noise. The splashing grosses me out. It gives me the willies.
You shouldn't get a bidet then.
Yeah.
I'm on mute. I'm on mute. No, I'm not.
No, you're not on
No,
mute.
no, you're not on mute.
We're just
Okay.
ignoring you.
I'm gonna re-ask the question because I want you to be able to give me a answer, Jordan. So,
Re-answer.
why do you think we don't communicate directly? Why do we fear communicating or saying exactly how we feel to people?
Okay. I think, yeah. The bigger reason will be that we don't want to disappoint. And at least for me personally, I don't want to disappoint. So I don't want to go and say, Spencer, your hair's too blonde. Your beard's too blonde. Sorry, man. Because I don't want you to think that
I've heard it a million times.
Yeah. And saying things directly. And by the way, I don't think it's too blonde. But so I don't want to disappoint people because I don't want to lose friends. And oftentimes you can sabotage friendships by just not even like breaching that territory. So that's a fear. And then I had this other one that I am completely blanking on. I can't remember what it is. But I think that we don't say things directly also because we don't have the know-how, or we don't have a better understanding of what's actually going on. Oftentimes I won't directly say something to somebody because do I really know that what I'm saying directly is the truth? And I mean, you really can say that I personally think that I don't know the truth of everything. And so if I say something directly like your beard is too blonde, I don't know the truth of that because where's the line of blonde versus too blonde? That's a stupid example, but I think those two reasons, disappointing people and understanding that you don't know everything about the situation and taking the risk of saying something directly is actually a pretty big risk unless you're Jesus.
Any other thoughts before I jump into a different question here?
Man, I've got a really good thought, but I'm looking for an example. So pass over me and come back to me because
I actually got to pee. I'm just joking.
Oh man.
I'm just kidding. I actually pee way more than you, Zach.
Again, I think for me it's a fear of hurting somebody's feelings. That's what it always boils down to. I mean, I know I've hesitated on saying certain things, but I think it's important to remember that in order to possibly help someone see your perspective, usually the most effective way is to try to understand them before you share a specific opinion. You know what I mean? If you're trying to change someone's mind about something, I don't think it's very effective to go in and say, hey, here's where you're wrong. Brian, it looks like you've got your mic up and you're ready to go.
yeah. All right. Let me show my screen here. I'm going to pick on Jordan for a second because I've picked on Zach too much. So I think at the center of our communication lies a certain need. And I'm curious, Jordan, to get your thoughts. I remember seeing this post of yours. In fact, it was like, I think it was based on a conversation that we had when I came over. But you posted on Facebook saying, what percentage of adults still require moral institutional dogmatism? Or a more poignant question, do you believe anyone has surpassed the need for institutional dogmatism to guide their life morally? I feel like you could have said that so much easier without saying dogmatism, institutional, or moral. And part of me is like, does Jordan have a need to come across as being very intelligent by using words that are complex? Because I feel like you could easily just say, hey, you know, can adults figure life out without being religious or not believing in God?
Yeah.
I feel like that's a way easier. So I'm curious, and you know, I've noticed this with a few other people on social media as well, but it comes across as it's very important for me, meaning Jordan, it's very important for me to come across as intelligent and be seen as someone intelligent online or in person.
Yeah. Yeah. It comes across as perhaps a pretentious, intellectually pretentious, perhaps. I think that was actually my point. To be quite honest, like I mean, if not the full point, I definitely think it had a lot of weight. Probably half of my point was to kind of express that, like, I think deeply about things, and I want people to know that. But the other half was I'm actually genuinely curious, and so combining those two, it was like I'm using these certain words and certain terminology to maybe call my intelligence basically.
You're weeding out the dummies.
No, and honestly, I remember reading that. You make a joke about it, Brian. I remember reading that and being like, I don't know 30% of those words.
like moral.
Like, yeah, well, moral
Like
I could get.
adulthood.
Moral I could get. But I mean, it was like one of those things where like, I'm going to have to do a lot of research before I even know what the question is.
Here's another reason why I stated it like that as well, because I don't verbally, like with my mouth orally, communicate as I'm on like 1.5 speed with my brain, whereas most people are a lot faster. Maybe half speed would be the better way to say that. I don't eloquently express it as well as I can just typing it up. And so I'd like people to know that I do have deep thoughts, even though I can't express them out loud.
I'm so smart too.
A lot of, so to answer your question, a lot of it was for personal gain, perhaps, but I also was curious about the answer. It was a genuine question, and that was probably about half of my intention.
So before we move on from this particular topic, I have to say, Jordan, while we're in the mode of vulnerability and discussing these things, if you haven't read this, you should. This book, Quiet. It's fantastic.
Hey, Spence, we're bleeping that out until we talk to the publisher to extort them for sponsorship money.
Susan Cain. So it's the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking. And I think, in my personal opinion, with communication, it honestly boils down to being humble enough to listen to people, you know, more than we speak. And so like that's essentially the whole idea of the book. There's a lot of introverts that think deeply about things, and there's a lot to learn from different perspectives. And, you know, though they may not be, you know, as eloquent or being able to speak, I hope that we can draw some of that profundity, which is a big word, out of you.
Very poignant.
Yeah. We can draw some of that out of you over time, Jordan. Okay. Let's go into another question I had, about what do we do? So how do we get better at communicating? I mean, I know that we talked about this before. We even started this episode. You could Google how to communicate better, and you're going to get, you know, 1,000 different blog posts with 10 different or 5 different tips to being the best communicator in the world. What has worked for you guys? I don't want to hear what the internet is saying necessarily about all of this, but I do want to hear personal experience. And you know, if you have things you have drawn from other internet sources or things that you'd like to share as well, please do. But how do you guys improve your communication? How do you get better at it?
I
Captain
like what
Z.
you said
Working on a couple of thoughts. Sorry, guys. Stand by.
No worries. No worries.
So I think the thing you said early on in the episode, Spencer, really resonated, is listening and getting an understanding of how somebody else communicates. And I know, as cliche as it sounds, charity never faileth, because it really, if you understand somebody and you listen to them and you try to love them, which I am not good at, then I think it makes for effective communication, because then you can truly understand where their values are, what their intentions are, and how they go about expressing something. And for example, Zach, I think, likes to explore and come to an end by starting without really necessarily perhaps knowing exactly what he's going to say, but he is able to explore and meander, and then by so doing, he concludes some amazing things. Other people might consider it and sit there and think about it and then say it straight. So gaining a knowledge of the other person, I think, is the best communication skill to have, and then hopefully not getting bothered by it, but trying to love them.
Yeah. I think playing into that same line of thought, I wrote down the idea of genuine curiosity. The best way to change, and I shouldn't say the best way. I shouldn't say it's the best way, but one great way to understand people, or to understand a specific person that maybe you're struggling communicating with, is to have genuine, keyword, genuine curiosity for the way they are feeling or acting. Because if you offer that and they can sense you're genuine and you're seeking to understand exactly why they feel the way they feel about a certain topic, they are more likely to reciprocate that kind of curiosity on your behalf as well. And I'll say that doesn't happen every single time, but for the most part, genuine curiosity is like necessary in order to actually, break down barriers and walls.
Well said.
Captain Z.
So there was I do think that communication, we're talking about so many things, and I think that a lot of times communication is just a manifestation of something deeper. Inherently, I think that's the case. There's a quote from a British person named Ben Jonson that said, "Language most shows a man, speak that I may see thee." And I would broaden it. If he's a really smart guy, then maybe I'm looking like an absolute idiot by trying to build on what somebody else said. But I would say that communication is, and I said this earlier, communication is bigger than what we say. Communication is bigger than why we say it, because a lot of what we say is the result of what has been communicated to us verbally, non-verbally, internally, because of what we're seeing. It is, I think that a lot of times we think that communication is the source of problems, but the problems are manifest in communication. And that a lot of times you get into conflicts. So when I think of Brian and I's conflict in Google Hangouts, I'm sure that it was the result of communications leading up to that. And so then we have to use communication to go back over it when, we don't, it's just much more complex than even the words that we said in that conversation. And I think that's also an important distinction. So, there is more. I think that language is a beautiful thing, and communication is super important. And I'm really frustrated with myself tonight in that I'm struggling to formulate those things. I'm grateful for the compliment, Jordan. But my meandering is taking a lot of twists and turns tonight. So I'll just vulnerably say that. But we're talking about I don't know, guys. Sorry. I got nothing right now.
I think what you're
That's all
trying
right,
to say,
dude. I
Zach,
love that.
is we were assholes when we were born, and we're going to be assholes when we die. Is that what you were saying?
Human donuts.
No.
See, that was direct right there. No.
Very clear, concise communication.
Oh,
Yeah.
that was a quote from Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. Anyway,
Zach,
share?
I want you to share, but I want to highlight the fact, like, Zach, and part of this is, so I want this to be real. You understand? Like, these are real conversations. This is how life goes. So, one, I don't want you to be embarrassed, Zach, by any stretch of the imagination, because what you had a lot to share there that was profound and good. But I feel like these are the real conversations. This is how communication breaks down. I mean, if anything, we'll look back at this episode and be like, oh man, that whole episode was a study of either communication breakdown or communication success. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, and one perfect example of my breakdown in communication is that I feel like oftentimes on this podcast I come across as being very kind of staunch and critical, but really when I think about it, I am just incredibly grateful that I get to spend an hour and a half talking to you guys on a weekly basis, and want you guys to know that it means a lot to me. And again, that's a good example of me not communicating that effectively and coming across different than the way I feel. If I were to summarize one key takeaway that I am personally going to try and implement better, it's going to be the exact same thing that Spencer said. It's going to be the exact same example that Jordan said in response to the troubled youth. If I do nothing else other than learn to ask very good questions and try and focus less on talking and focus more on asking good questions, I think that would make a world of difference.
Do you guys know who Robert K. Greenleaf is? He wrote a bunch of books about servant leadership. It's like this segment of leadership. And I've read a lot of his books. They're fantastic. But there's one conversation he was having with a lady, and she sat down, to interview him. And they're outside of his home. I can't remember if they're sitting on a porch or, sitting and looking out at the mountains or something. And she goes to ask him something or to say something. And he stopped her and he said, "Don't talk unless you can improve on the silence." And she stopped and they just sat there for, who knows how long. And I think, I almost feel a little bit hypocritical, as I sit here and talk into a microphone while a camera's facing me, because I don't have profound things to say, but I think the wisdom in that statement is real as it pertains to communication. If we can't improve on the silence, we've got to learn to allow the silence to be what it is, because that will probably teach us more than any amount of speaking could. So with that, we can pass it around. We've had some fun here this evening, but some real conversations. Any final thoughts people have before we come to a close? It was the true eye of the storm this evening. All right. Thank you.
Well, let me just play us out then with
the sound of silence.
Yes.
I think.
Hello.
No, I'm gonna play us out. I'm really concerned about one of our our great world leaders right now who is struggling health-wise. So I thought I'd pull up a Kimspiration. And one that really speaks to
Boris?
me is where
Oh,
he
yes,
says,
he was struggling.
be daring,
Poor guy.
be different, be yourself. Wise words from the Supreme
Mm.
Leader himself. So thank you very much.
Inspiration.
And God
Hashtag
be with you.
Kimspirations.
What a Kimspar. What a Kims. I can't even say it. Thank
I
you.
wish we could do sounds of silence right now. Zach would actually dominate that song.
This song, I think, is Zach's song.
Oh, that's right in his range.
It's so
It's right in your singing
Zach's
range, isn't
song.
it, Zach?
Perfect.
My old friend.
I don't know, man. I never thought of myself as a Paul Simon, but I mean, I certainly appreciate his lyricism or whatever his lyrics.
All right.
This episode brought to you by Diet Shasta grapefruit flavored caffeine free
By Mason Jars.
and Kerr mason jars.
And by Greek Gods yogurt.
Oh.
And by
You're
water.
drinking
Get
your
it at your
yogurt?
local river, lake, and stream.